My brothers and sisters, happy Easter. John 3:16. We've seen that name and we've seen those numbers many places. Highway underpasses, most public sporting events. You'll see one fan or a few fans with a placard in the stands, John 3:16. It's a very familiar passage. We heard it proclaimed at the beginning of today's gospel. But the mystery to me is why it's not paired with 17, which is the fulfillment of that passage, which helps us understand why God sent his Son and what it means for us. God sends his Son for abundance of life. God sends his Son not to judge us at this point, but rather that through him we might discover the fullness of our human life, and we might discover the fullness of the relationship that God calls us to. In a real way, this brief passage summarizes the gospel. It summarizes salvation history. Because you see, when God builds his covenants with humanity, as he's done since the beginning of salvation history, he doesn't give us a little box. He doesn't give us a narrow and constricting path. He gives us the abundance of life. He gives us the freedom to take the gifts he's given us and to make our response, not out of compulsion, but freely, responding to that love God has given us with our measure of love. Where we struggle is that we don't often trust that God is as abundantly generous as he actually is. And so we begin to see, as we hear from the beginning of the Garden of Eden, that though God gives us abundance simply because he sets certain things out of our limit, we feel constrained. This image of God who is providential, this image of God who is a God of communion and comes to share his life, can be turned quickly into the God of little boxes, who limits, who judges, who's there waiting to smite us if we step out of line. But that is not who God is. That's the caricature that we draw for ourselves when we fail to recognize God's omnipotence and God's glory. Because you see, God is infinite and we are not, and we know that. But we forget to allow that to be the guiding principle in our relationship with God. Because if God is infinite, then his love is infinite. His desire for our well-being is infinite. He is not limited like we are. He's certainly not petty like we are. And he's not watching hawkishly over every of our motions just to see how well we do or don't do in response to his gifts. Yes, he watches over us, but he does so providentially, with the eyes and the heart of a loving Father who desires what is best for us, who is there to lift us up when we struggle and fall, who is there to rejoice with us in our higher and more joyful moments. This is the relationship God has called us to. It is a relationship of love. And love, which is the very life of God, doesn't constrain. Love does not limit. Love desires what is best for the beloved. Love looks out for the beloved, provides those conditions that are within reach to help the flourishing of the beloved. So the more the beloved is lifted up, the one that loves rejoices. And that is God's position towards us. God, who creates us out of love, rejoices when that love takes root within us and flourishes. Love cannot be forced. It's given freely. As we know in the relationships of family and friends and our loved ones, when we control, when we doubt, when we give in to fear, that no longer is a true flourishing of love. But rather when we freely trust the good we give, when we freely trust and pray for our loved ones, that freedom allows love to be cultivated. And what we know in our human experience is magnified infinitely in that relationship God calls us to. He calls us to life. He calls us to flourishing. Rather than giving in to that fear and that doubt of saying, if I follow God, I'm going to miss out on this. If I disappoint God, I'm going to fail in this way. Think of it this way. God knows you perfectly. He desires what is best for you. Trust him in this and follow him joyfully each day. Give your best gifts to the Lord. Let him guide them. Let him bring them to flourishing. And in that love, in that relationship, may you find joy in this life and forever in the life to come.